Cool, so I know it's the last session of the day, so I'm between you and beers or whatever your preferred drink of choice is. So I'm gonna show you a bunch of data, and I mean that pretty sincerely, so hopefully everyone's gonna stay awake. But just so I can get a feel for the room a little bit, who's at a company right now that's doing, let's say, over 75 million a year? Okay, over 50 million, over 25, over 10, over 5, under 5? Okay, some of you didn't raise your hands, so I don't know. All right, cool. And who in here is from product, works in product, marketing, sales, finance? Who else? Anyone else? Did we miss anybody? No? Engineering? Oh, we have some engineers. Sorry, not an engineer. That's clearly my fault there. Okay, cool. And then who's been in software for, let's say, longer than like 5 years? Okay, longer than 3? Okay, under 3? Okay, cool. Just like to get a good calibration because there's a lot that we're going to talk about today, and I just want to make sure that we're making this as applicable as possible. And also, like, no excuses, but you'll have to forgive me a little bit. I just got off a flight from Warsaw and literally came from the airport. And so it's one of those things where I'm a little jet lagged, so it's either mean I'm going to be like frantic in terms of energy or I'm going to be low in terms of energy. There's like no middle ground here. So, and also if you don't like dad jokes, this is going to be a really long presentation for all of you. But yeah, so you heard a little bit about my background. My background's in econometrics and math, and we started Price Intelligence about 5 years ago. And the main reason was because we were working in marketing and product, and what we realized is a lot of companies basically would put a lot of thought, a lot of effort into their products. And then when it came time to actually put a price or a value on those particular products, a lot of our answers were, like just throwing out $50 a month or just throwing out something out there, and then inevitably not putting any like data or actual science into it. And so what we're going to talk through today in particular is we're going to get to pricing. We're going to show you a nice little framework on how you guys can set up pricing within your business. But what we're really going to talk about in the beginning to kind of give you some leverage as to why this stuff's really, really important is I want to go through how growth is changing. And in particular, the main thesis that I really, really want to talk about here is that the world we live in right now, the world of SaaS, the world of software, where we are in terms of acquisition, et cetera, has put us in a place where the main lever of growth that a lot of us were able to kind of use and leverage to grow our businesses for the past 5 to 10 years, i.e. acquisition, at least as we know it, is now dead. And we're going to unravel that a little bit. We're going to support that with some data. We're going to support that with a couple of other fun little anecdotes. But that's really what we're going to be unpacking today. So the first part of the presentation, we're all going to feel bad about ourselves and our businesses, I promise. And then the second half of the presentation, we're going to build everyone back up and give you a nice little framework on how to fix some of this stuff, or at least be much more cognizant of it within your business. But to kind of give you some background, we talked a little bit about our 2 products. We have these 2 products. One is Price Intelligently. The other is Profitwell. Profitwell, it's basically you plug it into your billing system, you get free access to your churn, MRR, all that kind of fun stuff. Price Intelligently, it's a suite of software where we actually help people with their pricing. And I'm not giving you this context to sell you or anything like that, but I'm giving you this context because at this point through both of these products, we've seen inside more financial SaaS and subscription data than anyone else out there. We have about 20% of the SaaS market using Profitwell right now. And then we've worked with about 500 companies on the Price Intelligently side. And so that's where a lot of the data that we're going to be talking about today is really coming from. And that gives you some context on a little bit of how we see the world. But to kind of kick things off and really unpacking this thesis, this bold claim of acquisition kind of being diminished in business, what we really need to start looking at is first the idea that the market is now saturated. Now what I mean by that is if you look at SaaS or software, or even just tech in general 10 years ago, it used to be that it was really hard to actually build a business. It was something where, not just from a technical standpoint, but even just getting out there, convincing customers to use software 15, 20 years ago, that was something that was pretty difficult to do. Now, if you could do it, it was actually really, really interesting because what ended up happening is you also had these marketing channels being created almost every single quarter in a very, very large capacity that you could then take advantage of. So you kind of had both sides. If you're able to get in, you're able to get over that technical hump or that building a business hump, and then you also were able to start to market, it was easier, quote unquote, to actually build a nice, really big, or at least a nice mid-market size business. But what's happening today with kind of the diminishing kind of effort that we've seen with technical products that have improved, as well as the fact that marketing has started to diminish in terms of its effectiveness, we're living in this world where unit economics just aren't what they used to be. To kind of illustrate that a little bit, what we've actually found is that competition, not only direct competition, but also indirect competition, is now rampant within a lot of industries. So we talked to companies that were around 5 years old, 3 years old, and 1 year old, and we asked them in their first year of doing business, I think it's about 1,400 companies here, how many competitors did you actually have? And what we found is that most of them that were started just about a year ago, they had just about 10 competitors. Whereas those individuals who are even just 5 years old, they're only sitting around 3 competitors. And what's interesting is that when we then asked these 5-year-old companies as well as the other folks how many competitors they had as of today, all of a sudden you're looking at double digits across the board. And what's interesting about this is that a lot of us, we might say like, oh, well, we can just overcome this with really, really good product. We can overcome this with, just really being really, really smart or building the next big thing or working in a space where there just isn't as much competition. But this proliferation of software, this proliferation of being able to build product very, very quickly has caused basically the relative value of features, the relative value of actual software to actually go down and closer to zero. So we actually looked at about 500,000 data points on willingness to pay for different things like core features, integrations, analytics, support, things like that. And what we found is that over the past 4 to 5 years here, those products that we were relying on to actually boost our value, to basically increase our expansion revenue, those typical products are actually diminishing quite frequently, quite dramatically down year over year. And to give you kind of an anecdote to bring this home a little bit, 4 or 5 years ago, if you were selling a B2B piece of software, you could sell a Salesforce integration for $1,000, sometimes $5,000 a month. But today, that Salesforce integration is just something that's expected, mainly because it's quote unquote easier to build a Salesforce integration with most products that are out there. Now, what's interesting is you, again, might be saying, well, we have a really, really good product team. We're working on spaceships, we're working on AI. We can just really, really get out there and build something really, really cool to kind of circumvent this particular problem. But the issue is that while this is also happening on the willingness to pay side, CAC is increasing pretty substantially. So what's interesting about, even if you don't have direct competitors within your business, you're still competing for attention. And what we found in both a B2B and a B2C environment, over the past 4 years, CAC on both sides has basically increased by nearly 50%. And the reason that this is happening is that everyone's got an ebook, everyone's got a sales team, everyone's got PPC ads, and all of a sudden you're competing with attention, and these new marketing channels aren't being created as quickly as they were 5 to 10 years ago. And so what's interesting about this is that the reason that we're seeing like the impact actually affect a lot of businesses is because most of us are really, really focusing on the wrong things within our business. Or at the very least, we're not balanced in what we focus on and how to actually grow our businesses. So we asked about 1,400 founders and kind of C-levels at different software and SaaS companies out there, and we said, hey, if you could focus on one thing in your business, would it be acquisition, monetization, or retention? What would be the one thing that you would focus on? And we expected, because we were talking to Fortune 500 companies all the way down to Johnny and Jane startups, to get a really, really nice even balance of people who are focusing on different things at different stages. But unfortunately, we saw over 7 out of 10 people, it was all about how many logos they could get in their business. They didn't care about how much money they were making per logo. They didn't care about keeping those customers around or that actual retention. It was all about how can we grow through this acquisition. And what's scary about this is that there are very, very clear winners and very, very clear losers in this environment that we're now in. On a qualitative basis, we looked at about 90 companies that died in the past 4 years, and we split them into 2 groups. The first group were those folks who were primarily acquisition focused. So those were individuals where the only numbers that were improving in their business were their net new leads or their conversion rate. And then we compared them to a group of folks that were more balanced growth, meaning their acquisition numbers were improving, but also their monetization and retention numbers were improving as well. Not necessarily at the same rate, but everything was kind of improving across the board. And what we found handedly is across these 3 different revenue buckets is that basically those folks were primarily acquisition focused. They were just focusing most of their time on those more logos, were the ones who were dying out at a much, much higher rate. And then we looked at about 500 companies across a lot of different revenue sizes. And we actually looked at this on a quantitative level. And we looked at what the growth rates were doing comparing these two particular groups. And what we found is that those individuals who were primarily acquisition focused, at least as of 2015, were actually growing at half the rate of those who had this balanced growth. And what's interesting is that primary acquisition focused growth of these 500 companies is actually diminishing year over year. Because again, there's all this competition happening, not only for the actual features that you're building, but also the attention of those particular customers. And when we looked at this on kind of a microeconomic level, so actually looking at the individual firm, because we wanted to kind of look at what the impact was, what we found is that a 1% improvement in your acquisition, so if you improve those net new leads, that conversion rate by about 1%, you're going to see just over a 3% boost in your bottom line. Now, if you improve retention, either net retention or your churn rate by about 1%, you'll typically see just under a 7% boost in your bottom line. And if you improve your monetization by about 1%, you're going to see just under a 13% boost in your bottom line. And what's fascinating about this is that when we timestamp this or we time box this a bit, we see that these effects are getting worse or better depending on how you look at it. So you've lost almost 30% of the impact of improving your acquisition over the past 4 years here. And what's interesting is both retention and monetization are actually improving at almost inverse proportional rates. So what's interesting is that when we talk to a lot of these founders, we talk to a lot of product leaders, marketing leaders, et cetera, and we wanted to get to what this root cause really looks like. Why are we not caring about this? Why are we not improving? Why are we not able to actually take advantage of what's looking at? What we found in this particular case is that the root cause is that we really, really don't know our buyers. So just for a show of hands, mainly because I've been droning about data for the past 10 minutes or so, who in your business here has buyer personas? Some profile, some representation of your buyers in your business right now. All right, keep your hands raised. Of those who have your hands raised, how many of you have, let's say, usage data per buyer? Okay. Raise your hand back up if you have unit economics per buyer. LTV, CAC, those types of things. Okay, we got one or maybe two companies back here still here. Same company, so we got one company back here. And I had 4 or 5 more questions. What we're talking about here when we talk about buyers is actual representations of who you're actually selling to. So Marketo, HubSpot, these other companies have been talking about buyer personas for almost a decade. But what's interesting is that to make these buyer personas actually useful in your business, you need things like most valued features, least valued features. You need things like the lifetime value, willingness to pay per buyer, mainly because these are the people actually purchasing your product. And especially if you're in a SaaS environment, this is going to make sure that you actually have efficiency in your funnel. And we're going to talk a little bit more about buyer personas in a bit, but what we found that was even more startling than, hey, we don't really have buyer personas, is that the amount of customer development that we're doing in our businesses right now is absolutely atrocious. We looked at 1,600 founders and executives, and these are from Fortune 500 companies all the way down to startups. The majority of us are doing 10 or less calls or actual interviews with customers in a non-sales capacity. So does everyone know what customer development is? You all okay with that? Okay, so for those of you who don't, customer development, it's a process or a framework of actually gathering information from your target customers in order to understand what you should build, how you should sell, what your value proposition should be, et cetera. Now, what's interesting is if you talk to any luminaries in tech, and you actually ask them, what's the number one thing that made you successful? Most of it always boils down to talking to customers. And we love to retweet articles that say, talk to your customers, here's how you do customer development. But most of us aren't doing shit. And what's interesting is when I show this type of a slide or this type of data, people are like, you know what, we don't talk to our customers. But you know what we do? We A/B test. We do a ton of A/B testing. Nope. Most of us aren't doing A/B tests either. Most of us are averaging 0 tests per month. And this includes marketing tests. Think about that. How hard is it to test a subject line? It's not hard to do. Most of us just aren't doing it. And what's interesting about this, and the reason that this should be so scary, and actually to bring it back to pricing, is that when you look at your business, and when you look at what you're doing, everything in your business, whether it's your sales and your marketing, all the way to your engineering, product teams, and your finance teams, are used to drive someone to a purchasing decision or to justify the product or the price that you're putting on that purchasing decision. And what's fascinating is that on average, most of us are spending 8 hours in the entire history of our business on that point of conversion. And most of us aren't really thinking about who those particular buyers are. So all of a sudden, that's why we have a lot of problems with our pricing and a lot of problems with our businesses in general, because we have no idea who we're pushing to this point of conversion. We're just throwing stuff up against the wall. And then when we get there, we don't know how to offer that particular product or that particular price to them. And most of us, what we do is we just build. Because again, software has gotten easier and easier to build. It's not easy to build, don't get me wrong. But it's easier and easier to throw up a server. It's easier and easier to throw up features. It's not easy to throw up good features. But most of us, what we're doing is we're basically just guessing and checking our way to success. But the problem is that we're all facing these problems with growth. We're all facing the fact that it's getting easier to build. It's getting easier to market. We're all facing these same pressures out there. So this old way of basically building a company just isn't going to work anymore. Okay. So that was the feel bad phase. Do we all feel bad? No? Okay. Don't worry, we didn't know this 5 years ago either. It's not like we're just some luminaries who just knew this stuff. But any questions on the data or anything like that before we get into kind of a framework on how to take advantage of this? No questions? No one wants to call me out on my data? I'm ready. No? Oh, here we go. I'm just kidding.
Can you expand a bit on the how monetization delivers so much more value to businesses relative to specifically retention?
Sure. So typically, so we were isolating, so keep in mind, those were like averages essentially. Like we were isolating the change. But normally, because most folks are so inefficient with their pricing right now, if you increase your ARPA, especially in a subscription business, and they even just keep your retention the same, you're typically going to increase revenue substantially relative to not increasing ARPA and simply increasing retention by the same percentage. So think of it this way: if you have someone who's $10 a month, and right now your like average retention is 6 months, just to make it really simple, and you increase that, let's say even by half to 9 months, you're increasing about $30. Whereas if you increase basically your price by, let's say, 2.5x or even just double it, you're going to get much, much higher gain out of that essentially. Like ideally, you want to do all three of these things, right? But most of the stuff that you see out there, like for advice, it's like growth hacking, this whole world of growth. And what's fascinating is that's typically only attacking that one lever, which is getting harder and harder to attack. So there's a lot of gain to be made on monetization and retention. Good question. Yeah? A little louder, sorry.
When you increase the price, that might reduce the retention. You might just...
It might, yeah. So the question was, if you increase your price, you might reduce your retention. We're going to show you a way that you can actually measure that, to actually figure out if that's going to happen or not. More often than not, what we find is that actually increasing your price, it will affect conversion more so than it does retention. Mainly because a lot of us are underpriced with our software or our products. I know not everyone's software in here. But yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about it in a bit. Here first.
So related to that,
Yep.
are you going to talk about how retention affects acquisition?
Not as much, but we can talk maybe afterwards and give you some insight into some of the stuff that we're seeing. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious how you use specifically talking to customers and interview style to determine pricing. Can you speak more about that?
Yep. We'll go through the framework of how you can actually talk to your customers about pricing and not scare them or anything like that. What's interesting is a lot of people were like really nervous to talk to customers about price. What we forget is that people understand that things cost money. And so what's always fascinating is if you talk to someone about pricing and they're like really skittish, they're probably not really a great customer. Now there are exceptions. There are certain types of buyers, realtors, interestingly enough, they're very skittish about pricing. But that's like just a different type of buyer that we can talk about. Anyone here sell in the real estate market? Okay, we won't talk about realtors then. Cool. Any other questions? All right, so let's solve this problem. And so what we're going to be walking through in particular is actually how to quantify buyer personas. Now, what we're not going to be talking about is qualitative customer development. And the main reason is because much smarter people than I have like gone through and actually walked through like how to do good good qualitative customer development. More than happy to share some resources, but this is basically assuming that you know a little bit something about your customer and you also have done some kind of interviews or some research, whether it's just looking at support tickets or actually having formal kind of coffee conversations with target customers. And the example we're going to use actually is really we're going to talk about Profitwell. So Profitwell, I didn't really go into the history of our business, but we started off with this price intelligently product about 5 years ago. And then about 2.5, 3 years ago, we started working on Profitwell. And the reason we started working on this was because we were sitting with a company that was about to IPO. We were helping them with their pricing. And we discovered that they were calculating their monthly recurring revenue completely incorrectly. So let me let that sink in for a second. A CFO who had taken 2 other companies public, this was his 3rd company he was taking public, was calculating the equivalent of you logging into your bank account, reading the number, and getting it wrong. That's like the base number. And so we were super excited. We were like, holy shit, this is the product. This is the product. We're going to build it. It's going to be amazing. Everyone needs this, and everyone needs those numbers, that kind of thing. Let's get the down payment on the yacht figured out, all that kind of stuff. We were pretty excited. So what we did is we followed a pretty common product development approach where we basically wanted to make 10 kind of disparate customers really, really happy. We used users because we didn't know what the pricing was going to look like. So we had a couple of large companies that we built a really bad MVP for, and then some smaller customers that we were working on. And then when we got to a good place and it looked nothing like this, we were excited and we were like, all right, let's launch. Let's launch this thing, which really meant just email more people. But as soon as we did that, all of a sudden we got, oh, you're like these guys. And I kid you not, 2 of our main competitors quite literally launched the exact same month we did. We were like, fuck. And then these other, big dogs for some of the bigger customers we were going after, they were like, oh, we use Domo for that. We don't really like it, but it's interesting. Or we use Insight Squared or Looker, a lot of tangential competitors. And what was interesting is then we did a little homework and there were about 36 other people that had at least launched either a landing page or they had full-fledged enterprise kind of analytics products that could be kind of looked at as a competitor for us. And so what we did is we stopped building. We literally, except for bug fixes, we just stopped and we started talking to our customers. And just to kind of not bury the lead a little bit, this saved us 18 months of dev time. This process. So it took us about a month and it saved us 18 months of dev time. Now keep in mind, we didn't have 100 engineers or something like that. So some of your businesses, it might not save you that much time. But for us and our small team of about 4 engineers at that point, it saved us a lot of time. And if you don't take anything away from this presentation, for the love of God, talk to your customers. For the love of God. Please, put a number on a whiteboard. It could be 3, it could be 5, it could be 10, it could be 30, depending on your size. But please have some sort of a framework to start really, really small if you need to, talking to your customers, getting feedback. Because as we looked at in the unit economics portion and the data that we talked about, you're going to die if you don't listen to your customers. You don't have to agree with them. You can do something different. Don't get me wrong, but you have to understand where they are, what their pain points are, and some of the data that we're going to walk through. So cool, how do we do that? So the model, and this looks super fancy. It's not that fancy, trust me. Everything you can do here, you can do in Excel. You don't have to buy anything to do what we're going to talk about. If you buy things, it normally shortens the time it takes to do it, but you guys know that money and time are basically inconvertible. But what we're going to do is we're basically going to talk about experimental design, which is just a fancy phrase for who we're going to ask and what we're going to ask them. We're going to talk about the statistical analysis that we can do with that data that we're going to collect and some basic models that you can use. You can get super fancy in this particular piece, but you don't have to in order to get some really good value. And then basically doing what you guys get paid to do, which is make decisions and basically get things moving forward with your pricing strategy. So to kind of start things off, the first thing I would do when I go back to your company and you're like, hey, we should really get some buyer personas, what I would do is I would basically take a spreadsheet out. Over the top, I would put what you think your profiles are or some of maybe the qualitative buyer personas that you have. And along kind of the rows, what I would do is I'd create a couple of sections for what are the features they value most, what are the features they value least, just get some estimates or some like true lifetime value numbers, some true CAC numbers, and then even some true willingness to pay, like some estimates of willingness to pay. And the reason is because you're not starting from zero. Like you have some information on who you're selling to, you have some success or at least some indications that you are going to be successful with these particular buyers. So you want to at least get that down, because even if you just do this, you're going to start to make conversations a little bit easier within your organization. So if you're arguing with your product leader and you're like, we shouldn't build this, he or she on the product team can be like, that's what Mid-Enterprise Mary wants, or that's what Mid-Enterprise Meredith wants. Cool. Well, if we agree and that's what she wants, that's what we're going to build, right? Because we're not targeting Startup Steve. It just starts to get you what I like to call a constitution within your business to have little arguments about what you should be building or who you should be targeting or what you should care about. And if you can't settle the argument, then you go get some data to validate or invalidate what Mary, Meredith, or whomever your personas are. So we want to get a little bit deeper here in terms of what our experimental design looks like. It really starts with a research question. And what I mean by a research question is you might be trying to solve like, who are our buyers? That's a pretty broad research question. You don't have to go too deep on that in particular case. Or it might be, how do we increase our annual purchases relative to our monthly purchases? That's a little bit more specific. But if you don't start with a research question or a scope of what you're trying to do, you're gonna get into a situation where it's a little bit garbage in, garbage out, because you're gonna try to collect and get a 45-page survey, which no one is gonna wanna take. And it's going to be pretty problematic within your business. So start with a really good research question. And then when we have that particular research question, we want to go out and we want to collect 3 types of data. And remember, this is the quantitative size. We want to collect demographic data. So if you're a B2B company, demographic data isn't like age, gender, those types of things, although you can collect that information if you think it's relevant. But it's things like, what's the size of the company? What software they're using? What's the size of the team? Those types of things. Then you're going to collect relative preference data, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then finally, willingness to pay data, which is ironically the easiest data to collect. Now, typically at this point, there's someone in the audience, and I'm not going to call you out, but someone in the audience is like, surveys, I hate surveys. And you're 100% right. I hate surveys too. But the reason we hate surveys is that we're really shitty at sending surveys. We're really bad at surveys. Like think about the last survey that you received from some sort of company. What was the first question typically in the survey that they asked you? They sent it to you via email. What do you think the first question on most common surveys is? What's your email address? You just sent me the fucking email, right? Super annoying, right? And the reason is like surveys are typically a really, really good tool. But the issue is that most of the time what ends up happening is, product wants to send a survey, and then all of a sudden marketing's like, we need to ask these 5 questions. Sales is like, we need to ask these 5 questions. And then you have a 45-question survey that's asking things like, what's your email address? And you're just not respecting your user's time. So we've sent about 25 million of these things at this point. What we found, there are a couple of things that we can go into maybe in the Q&A session. We have some articles that we wrote on like what's good or bad surveys. But to just give you a couple of rules here, if you're sending something that's not compensated, meaning like individual compensation, like raffles don't typically work too well, but like, hey, we're gonna give you $50, we're gonna give you $50 to answer these questions. If you're not gonna do that, it has to be between 30 and 60 seconds long. A maximum of 4 minutes. And the reason you don't want to go over 4 minutes is because what starts to happen is it's not the response rate, it's the quality of responses tanks. So you'll get a bunch of people who might respond, but the quality of the responses are really, really bad. And the way that you're able to do 30 to 60 second surveys really, really effectively is you keep in mind that you can start to send a survey. If you're doing it well and you're training your user base to answer these surveys, you can actually send them every 3 to 6 weeks. So the way that we do this internally is we have kind of an A and a B team of our users who we're surveying. The A team, it's like every 6 weeks, and then at every 3rd week, we actually send it to our B team essentially. So essentially everyone's receiving a survey every 6 weeks, and then if they don't answer the survey, I think 3 times in a row, we just kick them out of the group. If you're doing this very, very like for the first time, you typically will see amongst like prospects a response rate like of 5% or so. For your actual customers, it varies depending on what you're building and what the relationship you have with your customers is, but you can get between a 10 and 15% response rate. Make sense? Cool. So how do we actually structure this? One thing to keep in mind around the demographic data before we move on is that you typically want to ask demographic information about things that you think are going to shift that particular user. So for example, B2B, a really simple one, is the actual annual revenue of those particular customers, because a really, really big company presumably is going to pay more than a really, really small company, right? And so you probably have some good instincts as to what those demographics are. If you don't, you can always expand a little bit. And if you're dealing with your current customers, just make sure you're really, really friendly with your BI team or your product team, because most of the things that you want are probably in the database somewhere, like usage, those types of things. Like, don't ask what their plan is in the actual survey. And most good survey tools that you can buy for like $50 a month, they'll actually let you like append the email to the actual survey link so you know who answered what, essentially. Cool? All right. So the tools that we're going to use to basically collect, they're pretty self-explanatory in terms of name. One is called a relative preference analysis. Any of my stat homies in the room, this is like a diet conjoint analysis, also known as max diff. Is that familiar to anyone? Okay, cool. And then the other one we're going to use is a price sensitivity analysis that gets at what's called price elasticity. Cool? All right. So what do people value? This relative preference analysis, what you're really looking at is, if I have 3 to 7 things, it could be features, value propositions, etc., what do people most prefer? And also, what do people least prefer? Now, typically what we end up doing with these types of questions is we might send someone a survey that has like 5 things, and we might say, hey, please rank this on a scale of 1 to 10 for each of the different pieces of that survey. Why do we think that's problematic? If I sent you a survey that had like 5 features and each of them you were ranking on a scale of 1 to 10. Yep. That's absolutely true. Cognitive load is high.
Rank them all the same.
People will rank them all the same. That's the hardest problem, is you're not forcing someone to make a decision. And what you can do is you can ask them basically a question that looks like this, which actually is a little bit higher cognitive load to answering one of those 1 to 10 questions. But the cumulative cognitive load of showing someone 5 to 10 of those things and ranking 1 to 10 is much higher, and you actually get much better data if you use this type of analysis. So here what we're doing is we're actually asking them, what is the one most important out of this particular list? And what is the one least important out of this particular list? And the least important is oftentimes actually much more telling in a lot of cases than the most important, because that allows you to kill those projects where you're like, oh, why are we building this if no one cares about it? So what's interesting is when you translate this data, on the right there, you actually get, and the math is fairly straightforward, you can make it much more complicated, but the basic math you can use pretty effectively. You get results that basically show you what those most and least are, not only on a rank order basis, but also on a magnitude basis. So all of a sudden, I know in this particular case that this particular feature is this much more valuable than that feature, and a lot more valuable than this particular feature. Whereas if I did the 1 to 10, I'm not really sure what the hell is going on and who cares more about what. And when you start to break this down, particularly on a segment by segment basis, what you start to find are like these really key differences between your users. So in this particular case, and I have to replace this with it's trending, but it's not the full data that we actually looked at. But the top one here, all of a sudden what we found, and this is true, these larger customers, and really a $6 million a year customer, like that's not huge. We call it mid-market, but it's definitely not like true mid-market. They really, really care about accuracy. Whereas these smaller folks, they don't really care about accuracy. And what's also really interesting about this is that when you make some base assumptions about who your personas are, so for us in those early days, it was anyone over $1 million ARR is basically our mid-market customer, which is not, again, that's not the true definition of mid-market, but that's just kind of how we looked at it. What we found all of a sudden was, wow, our startup Steve really cares about price, which is like the worst thing you want to see. And they also really care about design, and we were not good designers then. We're doing okay now, but not then, definitely not then. And they don't really care about actionability or depth, whereas these larger folks, they really, really cared about accuracy and depth. And so quite literally with one question, we probably could change our entire product roadmap. Just by asking this one question, making some basic segmentation, and then making some decisions based off of it, we would know that if we were going to continue to play in this space, we needed to be accurate, and we needed to have some depth to our particular metrics. But what's cool is we had a little bit of foresight because we do this for a living, and we asked willingness to pay questions. Now, willingness to pay, a lot of times people are really scared to ask these types of questions, but as we kind of talked about, like people know things cost money, but that doesn't mean you can just be like, how much are you willing to pay for this, right? Because that's actually a really, really hard question to answer, going back to cognitive load. And the reason for that is because psychologists and economists have studied basically how people think about value for a couple of decades now. And what they found is that we think about value as a spectrum. So what I mean by that is we know that this bottle of water is worth less than this projector. And we know that both of those things are worth less than this entire building. It's a very, very dramatic example, but that's how we think about value. We only know what a computer costs because we've purchased a computer, or we know what someone else was purchasing a computer at, or we saw the ad where there was a bunch of different kind of anchors of different types of computers out there being sold at a particular price. And so we can actually take advantage of that by actually asking in ranged questions to get at what willingness to pay looks like. And so what you can do, and depending on what you're selling, you can change these up a little bit, but I can ask, at what point is this way too expensive that you'd never consider purchasing it? At what point is this a really, really good deal? And almost most importantly sometimes, at what point is this too cheap that you question the quality of it? Time and time again, and I think it's like a psychological thing, it's more of a dev-focused company. Typically what'll end up happening, well, it's pretty split depending on who you talk to, but, oh, this isn't worth as much. This isn't worth as much. This was easy for us to do. Well, people are willing to pay for that easy thing to do, and you might be pricing it way too low. But what's cool about this type of data is that when you translate it, you get output that looks like this. So each of those questions corresponds to one of these lines. At what point is this way too expensive, getting expensive, a good deal, and too cheap? So you have this nice little diamond pattern that allows you to see, like, are we in the right ballpark of where we should be selling? And if you break this down on kind of a segment by segment basis, you can actually see how those different segments actually move in terms of willingness to pay. And you can actually see who's worth more and who's worth less in terms of what you're actually selling for these particular types of personas. And you can even break it down on things like role. What's pretty fascinating is if you're doing a go-to-market strategy, like who you should be targeting as your influencer, your actual buyer. All of a sudden you have this sales enablement information if you just collect some basic data. And if you get at this price elasticity curve, what's really, really fascinating is you can start to see not only kind of what you want to maximize for and what that answer to the question is, but you can also see where you should not go, probably on both ends of the spectrum. We've had plenty of examples where people were priced down here, and they increased their price even to here, and they not only double their ARPA, but they also double their actual conversion rate. And we've also had a good number of examples where they were up here, and people didn't want to pay what they actually were selling for, and they needed to change fundamentally who they targeted, or actually needed to build a different product for that particular persona. But what's interesting about this data, what's really powerful about it, is that it helps you make these really, really good decisions with not a lot of work. So what you're seeing here is actually the initial data of willingness to pay for a SaaS metrics product across different size companies. And one second here, before we get to your question, who sees a problem here? Or what's the problem with this distribution right now? So on the low end, they're willing to pay about $50 a month. On our high end, quote unquote, about $250 a month. There is a problem. Why do you think that's a problem? Keep in mind it's a SaaS product, so not all of you might be in SaaS or subscriptions. Okay, so the issue is that we're selling an analytics product here, and our smallest customer and our largest customer are only separated by 5x. And the issue there is, and this is something you guys have to think about earlier in your businesses than later, is that we don't have a lot of opportunity for expansion revenue. So not everyone's going to upgrade every single month, right? You know, it's not a really great experience if people just have to keep paying every single month if they're not using more and more of the product. And so we were pretty depressed when we saw this because we were like, well, we could sell this, we could definitely push it out in the market, but we're not really going to be getting good expansion revenue, and we're definitely not going to be getting really, really good MRR. And this is the classic thing with analytics products. Any of you who are selling analytics products, like, there's so much work put into them and no one respects them. Like, no one is like, oh, I just used it once a month. Yeah, but it saved you like a month of time to use it that once a month. People are like, oh, we don't need it, right? And this is why when you look at a lot of companies in the analytics space, a lot of their retention curves bottom out like close to 20, 25%, because it's really only the hardcore people who are really using those particular products. So we saw that in particular with this type of data. And before I get to the question that was in the audience, what we found, which was really, really sad, was that basically our willingness to pay per month was around here. Our estimated lifetime value, just based on some basic back of the envelope calculations, was right around there. And our customer acquisition cost was going to be there. And this is a little bit more obvious. Why is that a problem? Anyone? State the obvious. Yeah, we're not making any money. We're losing money. And what's fascinating about this in particular is that, like, you guys might laugh at this, but there are people in the room that are suffering from this right now. One of the most successful customers we've ever had, and I say that jokingly because I don't know if we did that much, because they raised 150 million, we're just throwing logos against the wall. And what we discovered actually through some basic calculations was that the customer that they cared the most about was making $1 million a year on their platform, which is awesome. But it was costing them $1,500 a month, not even CAC, just like actual cost. And they were only willing to pay $30 a month. So they had all of this horrible like targeting, they had hundreds of people already, and they had to fundamentally change their entire DNA to go more towards the mid-market and the enterprise because they just had this horrible value kind of dichotomy happening on the lower end. And what's really interesting about this is that what I'm really excited about is, so one of our competitors, they make all of their financial numbers public, and this turned out to be basically, I think it was plus or minus 5% in terms of like actual reality, which was pretty cool to see. But I'll tell you like what we did based on this information after answering some questions. Got one? Yeah.
So the question I had was about asking your customers for pricing. So how you phrased the question was what you would pay per month, assuming your customers wanted a standard SaaS model. But what about alternative pricing? Like what I really like is a company called Procore on its self-construction tech software.
Yeah.
Actually, they price on the size of your business. And that's like a genius thing, because for small businesses it's easy, and for big businesses it's expensive.
Yeah.
You throw it together, you get whatever you need to be successful.
Totally.
How do you explore different types of pricing other than just standard SaaS?
So the important piece here is not basically the first half of this question. The first half of this question is supremely flexible. So meaning you can ask like in that particular case, I would just the first thing I would probably do besides making any assumptions around monthly or by 100 visits or by whatever is just flat out ask at what monthly price is product too expensive that you never consider purchasing it, just to get a baseline, because then you can do a bunch of segmentation on the back end to see oh, this is the willingness to pay of large companies versus smaller companies, and it won't necessarily be as pinpointed as you want to actually make a full pricing decision. But you'll have a baseline here and probably figuring out what that value metric should be. And that's what you're talking about really, is your value metric. And figuring out value metrics is probably one of the most important things to do earlier in your business, particularly because that's what's gonna make sure that you don't have problems like this. And you wanna basically figure out where is that willingness to pay axes in terms of we can guarantee that we're gonna have really good expansion revenue so that we're charging big companies big money, we're charging small companies small money as well, if we're targeting those two particular individuals. And to figure out value metrics, just to give a really quick way to do it, what I would do is I'd put one of these together. I put two questions for two different groups. One would be, when you think about paying for X, what's the most preferred pricing metric? What's the least preferred pricing metric? Then I would also say, when you think about where you get value from X, where do you see you get the most value? Where do you see you get the least value? And it's two different ways of answering kind of a similar problem. And then what I would also do is, for the, I would do a baseline like we just talked about, and then I would also do a bank of these for one of the groups for the leading value metric. If you're doing it based on their size, you're probably not gonna ask based on $1 million in revenue, but if anything's based on usage, per X, per Y, per Z, I would throw that into this particular case as well.
Do you have any suggestions for discovering new ways of pricing a product? To stick with the Procore example, they were the first people who started charging like that, and now everyone does it. It's genius.
Yeah.
Do you have any
So I think so most of the time incumbents don't like charging like this because they can reinforce not having to prove performance, if you will. And so with Procore in particular, it's not, I don't think it's that, BIM and some of these other folks didn't want to charge that way. It's just that they were able to command higher premiums, and then they were pushed that way by kind of what's happening in the market. So what I would suggest doing is look at usage, but don't always count on usage. Meaning if you're looking at really large companies and really small companies, see what the difference looks like. If you can get as close to performance as possible, that's really where you want to sit. But you always can't do that, mainly because you can't measure it. So think about HubSpot or Marketo. The true value there is them bringing you more business, right? But they can't measure that with the product that they have. So their proxy is essentially leads or contacts, right? Because theoretically you have more leads, more contacts. Even if everyone doesn't get the same value per contact, you should be making more money. So that's how we're going to scale our pricing, right? So it's just kind of a little bit of a thought exercise from a qualitative standpoint, and then asking some of those folks hey, what if we charge based on this or based on that? And then doing some of this quantitative research to kind of reinforce that. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's really good. Talk to me a little bit. We've written a lot on value metrics, and I can get you some info on it. Yep.
I had a question about statistical significance for this. If you're a startup, you just don't necessarily have that many customers. So how many surveys are you talking about sending in order to get this type of data?
Yeah, so to give you context, this was about 300 companies, and we didn't have access to any of them. So what we did, and this is a nice little hack for most folks doing research in a company, we use what are called market panelist companies. So there is an entire industry that you might not know about where their entire goal is to get you access to anyone from a soccer mom or dad in the middle of Kansas all the way to a Fortune 500 CIO in order to answer a 15-minute survey. Fortune 500 CIO costs a hell of a lot more, but it's one of those things where, again, you're trying to save time here. And so what we did is we used one that was called Ask Your Target Market, aytm.com. And then we also have our own IP that does some of that stuff as well. And so it's just one of those things where we had that access, but you can buy that access very, very easily. Yeah.
You're not necessarily, as a company, you're not necessarily targeting your own customers to survey, you're targeting the target market.
Yeah, good question. So ideally what you want to do is you want to collect from 3 different groups: your customers, your prospects, and then your target customers. Target customers being people that you want but have never heard of you. And the reason is because theoretically your value should increase, right? People who've never heard of you should be willing to pay the least. Prospects who have heard of you but aren't purchasing should be a little bit more. And customers should be the most. And that's really, really good to cross-reference. But in this particular case, our research question was, do we continue to build this product? It wasn't like we're trying to find some really, really precise piece. It's a great question. Yeah?
Super tactical. Do you ask all 4 questions to all 100 people?
Yes.
And do you give them the same options in each one? Or are you varying up?
So these should be, if you're doing this the first time, especially in a baseline, you should give it open-ended. So it's not like they have an option to choose. If you're in an enterprise environment, meaning you don't have a ton of access to these types of folks and you have a higher deal size, I wouldn't ask all 4 of these, but you're probably not going to do it on a quantitative basis either. So imagine you're on a phone call, even in sales, this is actually kind of a really interesting thing to do. And they ask you about budget, or you ask them about budget, and they do the whole, well, how much does it cost? And this whole dance that you go back and forth on. Well, one thing that you can ask, whether it's in a sales combo or actually in kind of a customer development combo, is I would ask them basically at what point is it way too expensive? Hey, you never return my call again if I quote this price. And then at what point is it a really good deal, meaning you'll sign the contract tomorrow? And just you have those 2 particular pieces because, again, a lot of us are starting from 0 data, and some of us aren't going to be able to get thousands of responses. And just a note on statistical significance. Statistical significance is not a number, just to be super clear. It's not 100 or 150 responses or 200 responses. It's more of a measure of variance. And so it's something that's really, one, you can sound smarter in meetings as well. Because a lot of people are well, there's 100 responses here. Is that statistically significant? And oftentimes, if there's only 100 in the population, then it's purely significant, right? So it's just something to keep in mind where we got 300 responses. We weren't making a $100 million bet on 300 responses, right? We were just trying to make our decisions with the amount of data that we had. Some of you, if you're making bigger decisions, you're going to need more data, make it really quantitative. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah?
How would you do pricing on a consumer-facing ad?
Yep. Consumer versus enterprise. So With consumer, we typically follow like the same path, and the main reason is it's actually a lot easier because you can get more access to consumers. And when you're doing a consumer-based kind of pricing methodology, it's typically an issue of just having such a fractured market. So think about like Lyft, for example, or Uber or something like that. There's just so many different types of people who could theoretically using it, from my mom in the Midwest who like is scared to put her credit card in a computer still, all the way down to like us who are like in tech, right? And so it's one of those things where the problem scape is just a little bit different. You know, enterprise, you're typically trying to find one beachhead or two beachheads. Consumer, you're just trying to figure out like who we shouldn't be targeting more so than anything. Yeah, it's a good question. But the methodologies stay pretty much the same.
Well, what about free users versus people who are paying?
Free? Okay, so free, big thing to keep in mind with free, freemium is an acquisition model, it's not a revenue model, right? So one thing I want everyone to kind of think about free as, think about like an ebook. Like it's an ebook, like you're giving them a product. Now, I think that a lot of the world is going closer and closer to free because everyone's got ebooks now, so we need to give something away that's a little bit better. But that's how you should think about free, and ideally it shouldn't affect your marketing or your pricing strategy until like you've figured out a lot of things around who your buyer is, because you're going to end up just getting a lot of false positives as people coming through. It's going to waste a ton of time. Some of the most successful companies that we've seen from a B2B perspective, and also a little bit from a B2C perspective, really didn't launch free until they were like 4 years into business. So Wistia, do you guys know Wistia? You heard of those guys? So Wistia didn't launch it until they were 4 or 5 years in because they knew all the answers to these questions. And then it was just a top of the funnel problem. And I think a lot of us, and frankly, it's more Bay Area than it is East Coast because we're like angry on the East Coast. I'm from Boston. I don't think I said that. Like I would hear like, let's do free, right? You know, East Coast is more like, where's the money? So I think just keep in mind a little bit more around that. And the real key to free is figuring out what that precipice looks like between free and paid. Because there's two types of free. There's essentially a fake free trial. So anyone who's used like Yesware or Sidekick or some of those products, like they only give you so many opens. And typically if you're a real customer of theirs, you'll get rid of those within 14 to 21 days and need to upgrade. Whereas Profitwell, which is free, is the other part of free, which is we're going to give you value forever for free, and we're going to like hope and pray that we're going to be able to get you some other value that you're going to pay for, essentially. Less hope, less prayers, you'll see in a second. Any other questions? Okay. So we saw this, we were pretty upset, or no, we saw this, and we were pretty upset. And so we kind of had the foresight, we were thinking about a couple of different products, and we actually asked willingness to pay around a retention solution. So we have a product called Retain that helps with delinquent credit cards and things like that. And here's where we saw like some really interesting data. And remember, we're doing this, basically a couple months into building the product, where someone who wasn't willing to pay $50 a month for analytics was willing to pay $150 a month for this retention product. And then we got into this nice, beautiful 4-figure MRR, which is my favorite place to be, with these higher end folks for us. We also asked about a revenue recognition product. So I don't know if there's any accountants in the room, but once you get over kind of $1 million here, and this is why I put this chart in here, that no one under $1 million ARR really cared about this product. Everyone else, nice 4-figure MRR. So we got pretty excited. And what was interesting is that then it was decision-making time. And so what you'll do is you'll have collected a bunch of this data, you've been brought in a lot of information, and now it's like, based on what your question is, you gotta make a decision. And for our particular case, what we ended up doing, and it's not really reflected here, but to kind of talk about your decision-making process, what you'll start to see in this particular case is, all right, this person's just not gonna be profitable, let's get rid of them. Hey, these two particular features, like we need to push that into that tier. And what's interesting about it is it's not rocket science. Like hopefully you've noticed, like none of this is like, oh, I need a PhD to do any of this. It's really just making a decision. And so what I recommend doing in particular in a lot of your businesses, because pricing is one of these things that we're all really gun shy about, literally put a calendar invite. We're gonna make a decision on this particular question by this date. And then make sure you collect the data to actually make that decision. And for Profitwell, what we ended up doing is we decided, based on what was happening in the market, that free made a lot of sense for us because we had all these like paid products out there. They weren't really doing that well. And we knew that SaaS, one secret that you might not know is like the actual SaaS ecosystem is only about 10 to 40,000 companies large. It's not that big. And so what we could do is we wanted to be like the center of that universe. We could offer them this free product that's really, really valuable to them. And then we could sell them add-ons, pricing, all this other stuff. So that's kind of how we made our decision here. But the biggest thing in this whole process is start small. Just really, really make sure you start with like, not, hey, let's fix our pricing. That's way too broad. But start with like, should we go up market? Should we get rid of this tier? Should we get rid of that feature? Are we priced correctly? Start at that level, collect some of this data, and just get on a nice little cadence. Like, if you're familiar with like growth cadence, get on a customer development cadence. Because remember, for the love of God, talk to your customers, right? For us, this took us 12 hours total. Everything you just saw, it took 12 hours to do. We do this for a living, so maybe double that for you, but that's not a lot of time. What we recommend doing is giving it to a product manager or a marketing manager, make it 20% of their job to like run this research, and then meet as a group, whoever the main decision makers are, to go through that data to make the decision and things like that. And it costs us about $2,100. So this was just because we didn't have access to those particular buyers. But like I said, this saved us 18 months of time. And at our stage, at least at that point, and even at this point, 18 months of time is a considerable amount of time to save, to not like, oh yeah, they're charging, so let's charge too, and then realizing that it's not working 18 months later. So implement that customer development process. And we wrote a book on this. It's free. So email me so you don't have to fill out forms and all that kind of stuff. And I can send it to you that goes through like all of the stuff that we do in detail, so you guys can do this on your own. But happy to answer any other questions, of course. And I'm glad I made it without bumbling too much on minimal sleep. So I appreciate your time, but yeah, let's ask them some questions. Yeah?
Have you looked at or do any data on people's preference for like monthly, quarterly, yearly?
Yeah, so what's interesting, and this is another note on this type of research, so one of the other objections I get, and I promise I'll get back to your question, is that like, you know, the old Steve Jobs, like, well, you know, what was it? I guarantee you the person who said the customer's always right wasn't that the customer. Or like the Henry Ford example, like if I asked them what they wanted, it would be a bigger car. And what's interesting about this is that, one, Ford got like smoked by GM back in the 20s and 30s because they didn't listen to their customer. And also Apple was one of the largest like purchasers of consumer insights like in the world. So I don't know, like it's one of those things where I recommend like doing the research and then making a decision. So what I mean by that in the context of your question is, like HubSpot, for example, they do a survey like monthly. People love monthly because they're dealing with this like weird SMB and mid-market customer, but they decided based on their CAC and their CAC recovery, it didn't make sense to do monthly, so they only do annuals. In terms of insight, like most people, like unless you get into the enterprise, they don't prefer annual, mainly because it's one of those things where they like to try before they buy. But what we found, and I can share this data, we have it, we're gonna release it pretty soon, that if it's below $100 a month, I think it's something like 50% of your subscription should be annual, meaning people opted into annual. Like that's how you should optimize it. And then it has like a smile curve, whereas you go down, and then once you get over, I think $1,000 a month, it goes back up to 50%, should be annual as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I only ask because like you had an example that was $5 a month, and like with credit card processing and all that stuff,
Yeah.
it gets down to like $1 or $2 in actual revenue.
Totally. Yeah.
$2 a year.
Totally.
Save a lot of fees. I don't know.
Yeah. That's the other thing, like make money. That's the point of a business, right? Like there are other points of building a business, but at the end of the day, like for you to, even if you're a nonprofit, to stay in business, you have to bring in more than you can. And, you know, raising money can only like build that bridge so far. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I love your blog. I think it's one of the best.
Thanks, man. Yeah.
Best blogs in the industry.
Thanks, dog. Appreciate that.
Where else do you recommend for getting perspective?
Only our blog.
And
No other blogs.
making sense of the industry.
Yeah, I think so. It depends on like where you are in your development, like in terms of your understanding of SaaS. Like I love like Brad Coffey, CSO at HubSpot. He doesn't write that often, but everything he writes is just money, like in terms of what he's doing. I can get together a list because like I think that we really like, and you see our style, which is like way too long, like too much data, like that kind of a thing. But I think that like a lot of stuff that Heaton Shaw puts out is really, really good. And then I can share a few. They don't blog as frequently, unfortunately, but I would avoid, no, I don't want to talk shit, but I would avoid like anyone who's like, well, when I sold this company to so-and-so, this is what our numbers were, like just avoid that stuff. Cause it's like, it's not that it's bad, it's good for anecdotes, but just a waste in terms of like actual data. I'm trying to think. Notion Capital actually has a lot of really interesting stuff. They've started to go into a good place. Skok out in Boston obviously writes a lot of this stuff that a lot of us pick up on. Yeah, you're stumping me a little bit. I'm sorry. I'll find a list. Yeah, email me. I'll send you some. Yeah, we have this post that we did on Quora that was like, someone was like, oh, who should you be following on SaaS thought leaders? And everyone put like the usual suspects. And then we went in and like, there's a lot of people who are like VPs of product or stuff like that at different companies that are actually more worth it, I think, in our respect. The WP Engine team is really, really good. And the stuff that Cohen puts out is really good. But I'll get a list together. Yeah. Good question. Any other questions? These guys are yelling at me, so last question. Last question? Is that cool? All right, last question up here.
How do you think this might change when switching over to hardware as a service?
Yeah, I think this is super relevant with hardware because the joy of hardware isn't in selling the hardware. It's in selling the thing on top of the hardware, right? So if you get your pricing right, you basically want your hardware to see if you can give it away for free almost, right? And so what's happening is you have real costs to kind of keep in mind. And one thing we didn't really talk about are like costs and competitors. Like those shouldn't be like the main inputs. Those should just be like ancillary inputs, mainly because like for you guys, and I'll presume your hardware business, you obviously have to cover your costs, but you want to figure out a way that you can provide so much value that like you can sell the hardware or try to get that down to free potentially, and then sell the software if you're in a competitive market. Yeah, almost. If you're not in a competitive market, then I would use your hardware cost to cover your CAC, so that you're basically making money from day one. But don't do margin-based stuff like, 30% markup, because some of the stuff that's being produced in terms of hardware can be like, 200% markup just because no one's seen it before. But if you're in like Eero or Google Wi-Fi and stuff like that, like they're probably losing money on each unit and they're trying to make it up on software and other things. Yeah, cool. Well, in all sincerity, like email me if you guys want the ebook. More than happy to share it. If you have any other questions, let me know. Like, as you can hopefully tell, like we're all about giving the knowledge away for free. So more than happy to help. Thanks, everyone.